Hello, everybody. This is Daniela Caruso. I am the director of the Center for the Study of Europe in the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. I am very happy to have here a person that needs no introduction, really. Graínne de Búrca. She's a phenomenal person, and she is one of the most prominent figures in EU law. She is also a community builder. She's been amazing at keeping the field of EU law together, and really, so many times bringing it to much higher levels than we would have been able to accomplish without her. So it's a joy to have her present her book to us. I will just say a few words. The full resume is online on her website, and it's of course extremely impressive, and much more so than I can convey now. Graínne de Búrca is the Florence Ellinwood Allen Professor of Law at NYU. She is also the faculty director of the Hauser Global Law School at NYU, director of the Jean Monnet Center for International and Regional Economic Law and Justice. She's been at NYU since 2011. Before that, she held tenured posts as professor at Harvard Law School, Fordham Law School, at the European University Institute in Florence, and before that at Oxford. She has also been a visiting professor at Columbia, a member of NYU's Global Law Faculty, and Strauss Inaugural Fellow at NYU. Her main fields of research are European Union law, which includes constitutional law and governance, human rights and discrimination, and international relations, and of course, international human rights. She is the co-editor of the Oxford University Press series, Oxford Studies in European Law, and co-author of the leading textbook on EU law. She is co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Constitutional Law, on the editorial board of the American Journal of International Law, Journal of Common Market Studies, etc. Without further ado, I'd like Graínne to begin. We are privileged to have excellent discussants today: Professor Susan Akram, Professor Tali Kritzman, Professor Ioannis Kalpouzos, and Professor Andrei Mamolea, who will join us in a minute. I will introduce the panelists right before their comments, but for the time being, let's start with Professor de Búrca's presentation. Please, Graínne.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela, for that very generous introduction. And I want to thank you not just for giving me the opportunity to talk about my book today, but I also want to thank all the panelists in advance for taking the time out of, your schedules during a pandemic when we're all exhausted with Zoom and with everything else and have multiple other responsibilities. So I really appreciate the time and the engagement. This book I'm stepping outside of my comfort zone with this book because, as Daniela said, she and I have been colleagues for years in the field of European Union law and working on that. But I have been thinking for a few years about the field of human rights and human rights law more generally. And there have been some ideas bubbling for a long time, and I was eventually prompted to try to write them down a few years ago. And I'll sort of try and talk a little bit about the not so much the inspiration for the book, but why I wrote it, and then to try to summarize some of the main themes before handing over to you. I'm going to use a PowerPoint just to help sort of structure it. I will do my best not to speak for too long, but I may slide over go quickly through some of them if I find I'm elaborating too much. So with that, let me begin to share the screen. Hopefully you can all see the screen now. So I've called it Reframing Human Rights in a Turbulent Era. I don't think the turbulence needs much explanation. We're all experiencing it, going through it. The reframing is really, in a way, I think what the book is about. I wanted to reframe the way human rights law, the human rights movement, and human rights advocacy is seen and understood, at least in the academic literature. And so it comes out of a certain frustration at the presentations or framings of human rights that I've been seeing and reading in recent years. So, why another book about human rights? Well, the first is the most recent, in a way, motivation is that the book is trying to respond in a way to critics, and they're numerous and different kinds of criticisms, different kinds of critiques, many of which are important and substantial critiques, but nonetheless it's a response to those, because one of the kind of messages being conveyed in many of the very prominent and influential critiques recently is that, you know, the end times of human rights are upon us. That's the name of one of the books. Other books are The Twilight of Human Rights, or Human Rights Are Not Enough, and so on. There are many prominent, influential, important critiques, and their message is that this is a sclerotic, disappointing, and ultimately you know, a movement that we should move away from. You know, the end times are upon us, and they should be. Something else should replace this movement because it has disappointed us, let us down, and not achieved its supposed aims. And so I felt that was both exaggerated, distorted, and also really unfortunate kind of message to send out at a time when students, young people, activists are looking for the kinds of framings and movements and ideals and pathways that they could take in order to address injustices in the world as they find them. And to set aside this particular movement as it has failed seemed to me to be wrong. And I wanted to try and say why I felt that. And so that's part of what the book is trying to do. And that's, I suppose, the sort of, call it political motivation for it, normative motivation. There's also the scholarly motivation. This is the second one, which is just, this is how it started in a way. It was a kind of a response to the scholarly debate within, mainly within political science, but to some extent within legal scholarship, about whether human rights law is really effective, and if so, under what conditions, how is it, and how does it become effective? So, you know, does it make a difference, and if so, what are the mechanisms by which? And I think these two are connected, that if we understand better the ways in which human rights law can have effect in the world, and make a difference in the world, it helps us also to answer the question of, is it worth it? You know, is it a movement that's a body of law and practice that has really reached the end of its time? Okay, so this I'll move reasonably quickly through. It's just setting the context, which is, you know, are we in the end times for human rights? We're certainly in hard times for human rights. And you know, on this slide, I'm sort of setting out some of the political challenges currently to human rights, to human rights law, to the human rights movement, to human rights institutions. And these will be familiar to all of you, and they overlap to some extent. There are distinct elements to each. The rise of populist illiberalism around the world, in many places, many parts of the world, many countries, in many different ways. The rise of parties, of movements, and so on. We don't need to look very far for that. And in the US as well, obviously. Authoritarian states grow, so existing authoritarian states, I mean, China is the most obvious, but really growing in stature, in economic and political strength, in confidence, and in global influence. So, you know, China at present, nicely flipping the United States practice of decades around, is going, you know, has launched a kind of a diplomatic initiative to train governments and countries around the world in authoritarian rule, you know, rather than kind of spreading democracy, it's spreading this more efficient form, etc., of political rule. So there's a growing strength and influence there of an alternative model that's not a rights-based model. Democracies are weakening. The quality of democracy in existing democracies is weakening in all kinds of ways. Renewed nationalism, which goes along with withdrawal from international institutions, including human rights institutions. We saw that with the US, but also Venezuela. I mentioned Turkey and Poland with planning to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women. And then less a withdrawal from, but creating an alternative human rights, illiberal rights universe, the Geneva Consensus Declaration. For those of you who haven't come across it, it's really worth looking this up. It's quite something, a gathering of authoritarian countries and the US around the world under Trump to sort of reshape and refashion rights. You can imagine in what direction, giving emphasis to the family and to natural rights and including property and so on, but very much a move against LGBT rights, against gender equality, against reproductive rights and so on. And COVID, again, having brought a whole array of new challenges for human rights, emergency measures, derogations from human rights systems, suspensions, surveillance, tracing apps and so on, all kinds of new challenges there. So certainly hard times, I think, for human rights for all kinds of reasons. But it isn't just political hard times, because I guess what what motivated me, as I was saying, in the scholarly sense rather than the political sense to write the book, was just the amount of intellectual critique as well of human rights law and the human rights movement. Many of them being really, quite powerful and important works, but adding up to a sense in which this, we should disengage from this movement, shift the attention of younger people and of activists and everyone to something else. What that something else is, the absence of any clarity on that is one of the things that frustrated me in reading it. But nonetheless, it's a kind of a common theme in many of these critical pieces. So again, I'll just run through them very quickly. Could give a seminar or a whole semester-long course on any of them, but human rights as a hegemonic imposition, a global north creation imposed on countries and communities of the global south. That's one that's familiar to any student or scholar of human rights law. Then less the geopolitical and more the kind of bureaucratic dimension from Kennedy, Koskiniemi and others, that, human rights has been really this elite, very managerial, bureaucratic, kind of organized from Geneva, these sort of committees and governmental elites and so on, managing and organizing, and then the big NGOs with them, kind of administering their vision from above. Then there's the substantive kind of political economy critique that, really human rights looks like one thing, but it was concealing a kind of a neoliberal capitalist agenda, with the focus on civil political rights, sort of deliberately squashing more radical socialist movements and facilitating neoliberal capitalism and sort of sidelining economic and social rights. And again, these often overlap, but I'm taking out some of the distinct strands. The idea then that human rights and human rights movements crowd out and displace more radical projects. And David Kennedy and Sam Moyn and others have written about this, and their suggestion is that we need to disengage from the human rights movement and abandon it as a failed paradigm, because more effective and more radical justice projects could be pursued. And one of the criticisms I make in the book is that there isn't really ever, that I've read anyway, a developed alternative vision other than a more politics, something more socialist, something, but not really spelling out what that would look like or why and how it would be a more effective pursuit of social justice. But anyway, that's also, it's a powerful critique, and it's one, again, that's not easy to answer, like, not without some evidence. And then the idea that human rights, anyway, apart from all of these other more powerful, pernicious claims, just being weak or ineffectual, and Eric Posner's book on the twilight of human rights really goes down that path. And Sam Moyn saying they just don't, he says they tweak the world a tiny bit, they don't make enough of a difference. So those are very significant and substantial critiques, and they're accompanied by a kind of the idea that this weakness and all these distortions and so on mean we should find something else as our paradigm for pursuit of global justice. So here I just wanted to put a counter argument in the first place about the end times, the weakness, the lack of attractiveness of the human rights paradigm, the lack of appeal to those seeking really radical change. To say, well, just let's look at some of the things we do see in recent years, and all of these, to lesser or greater extents, have used human rights discourse, vocabulary, and institutions in some cases in their movement. So Black Lives Matter is explicitly described as a human rights movement and not just a civil rights movement by its founders. The climate marches and strikes, surprisingly for many, have kind of brought human rights and human rights language into their, and strategies into their movement and into their methods. There are civil and political rights protests in many parts of the world. You know, most recently we see these in Belarus and Russia, but you know, we've seen them in Thailand, Hong Kong, more recently Nigeria, and so on. And often they're you know, we can't show, you know, what they've achieved yet. You know, these are movements, you know, that are underway at present and struggling in very difficult political contexts, but there is no sense in which people have given up on the idea that they have rights and that they can claim and should mobilize to claim them. Then we have the many economic justice protests in many parts of the world. And again, in these, sometimes the language of human rights is less or more evident, but it's part of all of them in one way or another. The reproductive rights marches, the most recent in Poland, Argentina, just before that, Ireland before that again, and women's rights marches, which are broader than, you know, addressing violence and many other issues, take place annually, and they seem to be growing. And in the book, one of the, well, amongst the case studies in the book are the reproductive rights issue in Ireland and the women's rights movement in Pakistan. And we do see a kind of a growing grassroots engagement with these. So that's just a sort of this is all context setting that to provide some pushback against the idea that the end times are here. So what is the book project? Well, I wanted to present a different account, a slightly different account, what I call an experimentalist account, drawing on some other bodies of scholarship of human rights that builds on existing theories. So I want to, you know, in that sense, reframe the way people understand the human rights movement. And part of that, you know, people have asked me before, but like just presenting it differently doesn't change the world. Just saying, oh, well, let's look differently at what's happening and describe it differently. But I actually do think that bringing other things into the frame, and particularly, you know, the elements I want to bring into the frame of looking at both social movements and civil society activism as core parts of human rights, not just as something that happens after the law, the human rights law, that's the real sort of center, but actually as a part of, an integral part of human rights and human rights law and human rights advocacy. And to look at the ways in which the interaction between social movements and civil society activism, international institutions and other kinds of domestic institutions, their ongoing interaction actually brings about change. So the book draws on 3 case studies. I'm not going to go into any detail on these case studies because there's just too much detail, and also it would take too long, but broadly speaking, I was looking over a number of decades at the movement for gender justice in Pakistan, at the different kinds of actors, of the activists, of the civil society engagement, both with domestic, political, judicial and other institutions, and with international human rights institutions and networks, and the ways in which very slowly and, you know, painfully and with incredible contestation and back and forth over time, these movements in Pakistan in particular brought about some really significant changes, very partial and very much an ongoing story and a long way to go, but you know, brought about change, both legal change and, you know, less obvious as yet, but gradually political change. And I'm not saying that the human rights law or movement brought those about, but the engagement of human rights law and activism with political, economic and legal systems has helped to promote change. And I've tried through the detailed, and I know they're excessively detailed in ways, but through the detailed studies to show, just to make it more plausible, that actually human rights and human rights law had a really significant role to play, because it's often very hard to show those. We claim it and it's very difficult. So I've tried to trace as much as possible those movements. The second one is disability rights, the disability rights movement in Argentina. And that's a more focused study on a number of campaigns for inclusive education that are still ongoing. And the third one, reproductive rights in Ireland, that's a little more high profile. People know about it because it was such a major change for Ireland to move from being one of the countries with the most restrictive abortion regime in the world to a fairly, moderately liberal regime through a campaign over some decades. And again, I've tried to process, trace, and show the role, weaving into the movement, the role of international and national and domestic human rights mobilization, law, and institutions. Okay, and so the book is aiming then to respond to some of the critiques, mainly not all of the critiques that I set out above. Particularly I don't address some of the idea of human rights as a cover for neoliberal capitalism, the weakness of economic and social rights. Were I writing the book again, I might have added an extra chapter on economic justice movements, but this is what I had done. The ineffectiveness of human rights and human rights law, I want to challenge that. The idea that we should, human rights is an elite bureaucratic project run from, Geneva and elsewhere, governmental centers, that displaces politics rather than is a core part of political action. And the idea that human rights really involves the imposition of an external framework and norms on societies, communities below. So the argument is the human rights movement is a very dynamic and vibrant one. And what we should be doing in response to the very important critiques is to renew and reform the movement rather than abandon it for some kind of unspecified alternative. So that's the message of the book. I'm looking at my time. I'm relying on Daniela to wave at me when I'm starting to go over. So this is the more legal, scholarly part of the book and the building the theory. The legal scholarship has not on the whole asked how does human rights law work, or does it work? It kind of assumes it and just focuses on what is the law, how is it adopted, how is it interpreted, and so on. It's valuable work, but it's not addressing this part of the debate. But political science theorists have jumped in there and they dominate the debate in this field. And the first batch of studies was really, well, there is actually one legal scholar there, Una Hathaway, who presented a study early on that was quite challenging, saying, look, human rights law, human rights treaties, once they're adopted, do they make a difference? Yes, they do. They make things worse. So she sort of drawn these regressions and said, the adoption of human rights treaties, and the focus I think was on torture, makes things worse in these states. And some other scholars then joined and said, look, little or no improvement after human rights ratification in these countries. Then there was a sort of a pushback by other scholars saying, challenging their methodologies. And I'm not going to go into this. I'm not a social scientist. I'm not trained in empirical methods or regression, so I will use the wrong language when I try to explain it. But basically, they challenged the methodologies, saying, but wait, the ways in which you've carried out these studies miss a lot and are, distorting something. And their work, they said, if you nuance the questions and the methodologies, drilling in a little bit, a whole series of these other studies said there is a positive correlation between human rights treaty ratification and improved actual practice and standards of human rights, where there is, and this was the important qualifier, where there is room for civil society, where there's some domestic civil society presence and freedom to act. Now, we could spend a long time talking about, well, what exactly, how much freedom, and what about authoritarian states? And I think there's a lot of, I hope the book, if anything, one thing it could do is to trigger research, other people really wanting to investigate better than I have. What about different kinds of regime? What does it look like in a very repressive regime as opposed to, a transitional regime or a hybrid democracy or a strong democracy and so on? My sense is that there is room for serious human rights work that can be effective in all regimes. It's hardest in the most repressive regimes. The price to be paid by those who want to be active is the highest, and it is most difficult, but there is room everywhere. And also that there is authoritarianism in every system, including in democratic systems. And there's some really interesting work by Lynette Chua on what she calls societal authoritarianism. That's really, I found it fascinating, and it was really helpful for me in thinking through when and in what circumstances can human rights and human rights law make a difference. Okay, so the two main existing bodies, this is just explaining my theory, of at least two of the big ones. I think these are the dominant theories of what makes human rights law work. The causal pathways, not does it work, which is the earlier debate amongst political scientists, but what makes it work, assuming we, accept that theory that it does work when you have civil society mobilization. Sickink had this idea, the boomerang theory was, civil society and repressive regimes can't do anything. They go out and ask for help. Help comes in the shape of powerful external actors, governments from liberal states, international institutions, financial institutions, sanctions, even force. You call in the aid from outside. Then Beth Simmons said, well, her theory was actually, let's look at domestic civil society. They're the ones who bring treaties to life. And she described her theory as bottom up. I don't think Sickink described hers in any way as top down, but it certainly gives the emphasis to external intervention. And following that, I found that a lot of the scholarship divides in this kind of binary way. It's either the international human rights courts, it's the special rapporteurs, it's the intervention, it's the sanctions, it's whatever, and others saying no, it's actually civil society, it's those who care, it's the movements. And I want to situate my theory situates itself in what I see as strands of a new kind of scholarship that's coming out, which is actually looking at the interaction between these, the idea that it's not bottom up or top down. There's a relationship and an interaction between international institutions and domestic movements. And, what I'm trying to do in my book, I think, in my theory, is to spell out a bit more, to sketch out what that interaction might look like. And I draw on the 3 case studies that I chose to do to try to sketch this out. It's at a fairly broad level of abstraction, and each of the case studies was really quite different, rather different campaigns, very different contexts, very different actors, very different, rights that they were trying to promote and so on. But I found that there was a sort of in common between them was this, what I call a kind of a long-term dynamic engagement between 3 main sets of international and domestic actors, networks, norms, and institutions. And I have a diagram, which is in the book, and I tried to put it on the last slide. I'll try and go to it, but I didn't do very well. So where I imagine it as a kind of a circle, because people always say, but where does it start? And, while in my mind, the engagement, the mobilization starts domestically, actually, it's chicken and egg, because the international framework and norms are very important. The idea of rights being engaged is very important. So I see it as a kind of a cyclical interaction between these different sets of actors, institutions, norms, and networks. Domestic, locally situated actors who mobilize to challenge practices, to claim rights, to highlight injustices. Transnational and international institutions that provide a kind of an external accountability forum. I think external accountability is crucial with human rights for every state, something outside the system, reflecting back to the system, listening to, facilitating contestation and debate, articulating legal and normative standards, and so on. You can think of these as courts, as international treaty bodies, as commissions, as other kinds of fora, but there are many of them. And then what I wasn't expecting, which came out through the case studies, that was what was in my mind before I started the work, was the idea of international and domestic, that also a really important set of actors, I've gathered them together in this category, I don't know if it makes sense, but independent domestic actors and institutions. So like domestic courts, if they are independent, to the extent that they're independent, ombudspersons, often the media, and independent media, but it could be legislative opposition and so on, that are independent of centers of power, private or public, and that they amplify and put pressure on, create traction, and help to localize the normative inputs coming from the engagement of the domestic and the international. And so the relationship between these 3, to me, over time, in a long-term, iterative, ongoing engagement, is what helped to push the rights claims in the 3 studies that I looked at. And that's broadly the kind of experimentalist theory. I'm going to just, for a moment, I'll come back because that's the last slide, is what does my account contribute? I'm trying to justify my book. This is the slide I was talking about. It's hard to read and not very, took me so long to put this graphic together. I need someone to help me with graphics. But, you know, you can see that there's an interaction between these three. These are the domestic activists. Sorry, it's gone again. So what does the account contribute? Well, what it does, I think, it places the practice of human rights and the work of those on the ground centrally in the frame, because academics like me, you know, come along and describe certain parts of the elephant, and you know, the parts of the elephant that have been shown mostly, I think, in scholarly accounts are these institutions, these courts, these laws, and you know, the practice of human rights is what makes, you know, that is what human rights is, not just legal norms that are adopted. So that is very important to see that as part of understanding international and the human rights movement more generally. It integrates civil society and social mobilization as crucial elements. It emphasizes this multi-level, not just, you know, one or other, but multi-level engagement and interaction over time. It understands human rights promotion as a long-term project. So we can't assess the effectiveness by looking at this court case or that, or you need, you know, that it's a long-term project to make serious structural change to entrenched injustices is a long-term project. I'm trying to challenge, I don't know if it succeeds, but the bureaucratic elite kind of critique of human rights and the argument that they're apolitical and somehow crowd out political responses to injustice. You know, in the examples I saw, they were deeply political and embedded in political responses to injustice. Doesn't mean to say that there wasn't sharp contestation, difficulties. There was a lot of that, and I think if those of you who read the case studies will have seen that. But also then I want to question this characterization of it's mainly external actors, it's mainly internal actors. And this last one is a kind of a little suggestion of, I suppose, a rethinking, you know, in legal theoretical terms, what is human rights law? I'm suggesting that it's a set of standards. It's not what's in the treaties, and it's not what a domestic court says. It's a set of standards that's continually co-created through the mutual engagement of different sets of domestic and international actors. So I'm going to end there. I've taken up my 35 minutes, and I haven't really spoken about any of the case studies in any kind of depth, but maybe some of you might have.
That's wonderful. I'm sure we can get, I want actually to get to the examples during the Q&A session. That's great, Graínne. Thank you so much for this. The metaphor of the elephant in a dark room and people trying to figure it out certainly applies here. Another one that applies, I think, is the baby in the bathwater, because it sounds like we can throw away a lot, but we can't let that baby go. So I'm very happy to have in the room persons who have engaged with human rights in a very practical way and have clinged to this sorry, they have they have focused on this legal tool in order to promote real change and have seen it happen. I have here Professor Susan Akram, who directs the clinic in international human rights at Boston University School of Law. There she supervises students engaged in international advocacy in domestic, international, regional, and United Nations fora. Her research and publications focus on immigration, asylum, refugee, forced migration, and human and civil rights issues, with an interest in the Middle East, the Arab and Muslim world, which happens to overlap with some of the examples in the book that Professor de Búrca is presenting today. So I would like to give the floor to Susan for the first batch of comments. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and honestly, I've been really excited to read your book, Graínne, for a lot of reasons. One is because my initial reaction was finally someone's putting together what we're actually doing in the field, and finding that sort of theoretical framework for what long-term human rights activists are actually working out in terms of making this project a project that delivers some remedies for victims. So thank you so much for this. And I have I had a lot of reactions. Um, and I have some questions about points of omission. Maybe I'll start out with the reactions. First of all, I think some of the critiques of the Human Rights Project are very much spot on. And those of us who both teach and practice teach some of the critiques in order to show the pitfalls of the engagement in human rights, particularly from those in the West who are engaging in human rights projects in other parts of the world. And that is in particular Makau Matua's Victim, Savage, Savior framework. My students all read that, and we spend a lot of time talking about that as a major trap of partnerships between the North and the South and the East and the West. Kennedy's challenge also about the imperialist aspect and the sort of top-down nature of where does the funding come from and to whom does the funding go and how are those decisions made. I think these critiques have a lot of merit to teach us about how to proceed in this human rights project. So that's sort of the first reaction. And the second is about questions of omission. Your work very much resonates with me with two authors one of whom you mentioned, but for different work, and the other you didn't. One is, of course, Catherine Sickink's work on the norm cascade, which really resonates with your work. And her work showing how the norm cascade changed impunity in Latin America and really helped to develop the foundations of the human rights, inter-American human rights system as a solid system that responds to extreme atrocities, is an important story that parallels your framework here. So I wondered about the omission, the choice of the boomerang theory from Sikkink as opposed to her norm cascade work. And the second is Rajagopal Balakrishnan's book, Human Rights from Below, which I think is also a parallel and an important parallel about how grassroots human rights work informed the larger human rights project from the beginning. So I wanted to put those out and then just focus for a minute on Pakistan, because I know it so well, and I know many of the activists whom you mentioned. Some of them were my schoolmates, and how long the struggle has been for women's rights in Pakistan. When I asked a number of years ago, one of my friends, I asked her the question, she's been at the forefront for decades. What has the women's movement achieved in Pakistan? And she had a very long pause before she said, well, they now know we exist. And I thought, well, I'm not sure that's such a satisfactory response for decades of hard work and serious risk for many of the activists involved. So just thinking about Pakistan and what a complicated place it is for doing human rights work, I think one of the pieces, or maybe actually two interrelated pieces, is the long history of colonial legacy that is actually a barrier to local engagement with the international human rights normative project. And related to that is how important it is, and I think more of us are realizing we need to think about this, to find parallel norms in the local and the regional, and to do our work within that space, at least initially, before referring to the international standards. So I'll just put all that out, my 2 cents worth, and let anybody respond.
Thank you so much, Susan. Really, I think this is very fertile here. So I look forward to the back and forth. I wanted to introduce the next person among in alphabetical order and also in the line of comments here, which is Dr. Ioannis Kalpouzos, who is now a visiting assistant professor at BU Law School. Professor Kalpouzos is a faculty member at City Law School, University of London. He lectured at Harvard Law School, where he taught a class on new technologies and the law of war. He also taught at King's College London and at the University of Notre Dame. Most relevantly today, probably, Dr. Kalpouzos is co-founder of the Global Legal Action Network, GLAN. And through GLAN, he has been pursuing important and extremely relevant human rights work in the field of environment, among others. I look forward to hearing what he has to say in response to Professor de Búrca's presentation. Please, Ioannis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I don't know if you noticed, apologies for like a jump from one camera to another. My laptop decided to do a 45-minute update just as the webinar was starting. And I did panic. Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this conversation and for giving me the opportunity to read this advanced copy of Professor de Búrca's fascinating book, which has incredible rich detail, both in I think general methodological and political aspects of the debate, and with respect to the specific case studies from which I learned a lot. So my comments are, I guess, twofold. One is speaking a little bit to the beginning and the end, as it were, of the book, and the reaction to the critiques that have motivated, also according to your presentation, right, the writing of this book. And secondly, as Professor Caruso said, trying to reflect a little bit on my work in relation to the type of tensions and the type of synergies, right, that you describe in the case studies. So to start, I share, I think, to some extent, Professor Akram's position in relation to some of the critiques, both in that, in some cases, not all cases, they are accurate in the description of some type of a human rights practice, but also in a sense, I wonder, so you point out and you describe how human rights practice is developing in terms of sophistication, and sophistication that is both practical and legal and doctrinal, but also sophistication that is strategic and political in many ways. And I see some of these critiques and some of that sophistication to come from the same place, right, in some ways. And I think also to some extent to speak to each other, right? And I think that very few of the people that you mentioned would, to also borrow Professor Caruso's metaphor, actually throw the baby out. They would probably sort of stop and pick up the baby, and I don't want to take that metaphor any further. But I think that, some of the critiques of, for example, Makamutua that Professor Akram referred to, or in some ways, Samoan, who I understand is a little bit provocative and can be kind of slightly, triggering certain responses in some ways, speak to how we do human rights, right? And what kind of human rights that we do. And you highlight and point out, and one of the few advantages of reading the book in PDF form is the Control F function, and I used it in terms of terms like politics, political, power, redistribution, and so on and so forth. And indeed, they abound, right? And you say quite clearly that human rights is inevitably political. But I think that, the critique is that some of the political aspects are not always necessarily acknowledged, right? And being referred to in a clear-eyed and conscious enough way. The other aspect is that not all human rights and not all ways of doing human rights are political in the same way, right? And only some aspects and some angles and some ways of practicing and doing human rights might be political in a certain way that, you know, is good, depending on I suppose, who is deciding, right, and who is acting. And therefore, the question is, how conscious are we of those political connotations and those political functions of specific rights in the way that they are framed, debated, articulated, defined, included in treaties, included in text, and the way that they are used in human rights action, which is also specifically political action. And I suppose that then goes back to your point about the relative vagueness of, right, the prescription, right, which should follow the diagnosis about how to do politics and how to do more politics and how to do more, if one wants, social or socialist politics, and therefore how to do the type of political human rights that go towards a specific direction, which I would argue also needs to be a redistributive direction, right? Which I think also speaks to some of the dangers and issues that you highlight in the last chapter of the book, right? Which I think entails the acceptance and the realization that, yes, human rights are about empowering people, right? Empowering in terms of recognition, empowering in terms of remedies, empowering in terms of certain results. But they're also in some ways about disempowering others, right? And they are in some ways in terms of shifting power from one constituency to another. So there are people and constituencies and groups that will and might lose in some ways when human rights law and human rights politics are being enacted and being promoted. Yeah? Secondly, while indeed all human rights might refer in some extent to some values that are universal, one doesn't need to go to the, you know, done debates about relativism and universalism to recognize that there are different, you know, political desiderata that are expressed in different articulations of rights and in different ways of doing rights. Yeah. So I think that part of the use of the value and of the efficiency also of human rights requires an acknowledgement and a consciousness of how exactly these items are being engaged. And some of the critique is that in the past, either because of a you know, naive or utopian universalism, or because of an apologetic or an exploitation, right? These politics had not really been engaged in a particular way, right? Which led to some of the critiques and also, I think, informs, as I said, some of the different practice. And then the second point is that, and I think that speaks to the rich descriptive element in terms of the interactions between different actors, including in the you know, beautiful chart that you created, is that there is a domestic and a regional and an international element, and that domestic, regional, international element also operates in terms of empowerment and disempowerment and success and redistribution, right? So human rights done in a way that fight and claim power domestically, but also to some extent internationally, and that shift those balances of power domestically, but also to some extent internationally. And the limitations that human rights have had in the past in dealing with some of these aspects might also be linked to some of you know, certain projects, emancipatory projects, you know, taking them on or abandoning them, right? One example being, of course, the debates on decolonization and self-determination and their relation to human rights in the 70s in that respect. So I come from a place that is I think to some extent similar to yours. So I come from a place that was both in some ways frustrated with the law and the way the law was applied, but also frustrated with some of the frustrations with the law and some of the critiques with the law. And indeed, I co-founded the organization that Professor Caruso mentioned after such a meeting of critique of human rights, which was held, you'll be happy to hear, at the Institute of Global Law and Policy under the benevolent aegis of Professor David Kennedy. And some of us thought, okay, all of these critiques are very valid, but how do you go about using them in a way that it's more politically sophisticated? And the idea was to create an organization that links academics and practitioners and harnesses that sophistication from a critical and from a practical perspective in order to achieve certain results. And that also highlights and I suppose works on such structural and potentially empowering and redistributive aspects of human rights in the broader sense, including other aspects of international law that are relevant to human rights. And for that reason, ultimately, ending on focusing on 4 themes, one of which is accountability and supply chains. The other one is war and occupation. A third one is migration and border violence. And the fourth one is environmental and economic justice. And I'm happy to discuss some aspects in terms of the tensions in all of these themes, but I will speak perhaps only right now, because my time is also ending, to the point of climate change that Professor Caruso mentioned. Right, one of the, so we have worked in the last 2 or 3 years and submitted a few months ago a case at the European Court of Human Justice, European Court of Human Rights. I conflated EU and human rights legal orders. You can shoot me on arguing that the failure of 33 states of the Council of Europe to reduce emissions constitutes violations of human rights. And in that process, we both wanted to highlight the human rights aspects of something that when we started working on, not a lot of people were talking about in the context of human rights. More and more people and also activists talk about it now currently, but also in the process negotiate connections between the domestic, the regional, and the global. Negotiating these connections in the way that our claimants, who are children from Portugal, speak also to human rights violations that others feel throughout the espace juridique of the Council of Europe. Connections that have to do with questions of redistribution in the articulation of shared responsibility for climate change. And that is, in fact, the hardest part of our argument in technical terms, creating an argument for presumptive shared responsibility, which leads the states to argue against that presumption. And also negotiating the balance between domestic and regional orders of seeking remedies and working with other activists and other constituencies that work at the domestic level, following, for example, the Urgenda case in the Netherlands. And it is in that process that I think the political stakes in negotiating between the domestic and the regional and the types of politics and redistributions are being enacted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ioannis. So we've put redistribution also on the table, and the interaction between redistributive projects and the human rights, many different agendas. So I look forward now to hearing from our third discussant, Professor Tali Kritzman-Amir, who is a visiting professor of international law and international immigration law here at NYU Law. In her publications, she focuses on comparative and international immigration and refugee law and policy. At the core of her current research is the relational autonomy approach to immigration law. She was a visiting professor at Harvard University for 2 years, an honorary research affiliate at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, and previously clerked in the Israeli Supreme Court. She is spearheading a webinar for the International Law Journal of the NYU Law School on the subject of Fortress North America, which is, of course, an adaptation of the critique of Europe under the heading of Fortress Europe. Tali, please. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you, Graínne, for the really interesting presentation and the fascinating book. I have to say that I read it with great interest and also found it really useful because it was such an optimistic read in a really challenging time, as you said, turbulent time. And I think that's the kind of read we could all use right now. I really felt that it was useful for my own thoughts about the progress or lack thereof of the human rights work that I've been engaged in, which was in Israel-Palestine in a context of refugees specifically. And I could really connect with the perception of human rights being not just a political ideology or a legal framework, but also a relationship and an interaction and a dynamic process of back and forth. So I thought that was a really useful way to look at things. I have to say that when I'm teaching human rights, I often have the students read some of the books that you've mentioned, including the Una Hathaway project and the Simmons project, that look at the effectivity of human rights in a very different methodological approach than yours. And actually what I want to spend my time focusing on is methodology, because that was something that really that I'm really struggling with in my own work, and gave me a lot of food for thought reading your book. So I want to ask a few questions, if I could, about the methodological choices that you made in this book. And obviously you went for a much more in-depth analysis of a few case studies rather than, that Una Hathaway approach of looking at a broad set of mostly civil and political rights across, I think it was 166 jurisdictions. Your approach was much more focused look on case studies, and I thought your case study choice was in many ways really brilliant in that you looked at different parts of the world, different types of regimes, different types of rights, showing that real commitment to the universality of the project. But at the same time, I was wondering about some issues with the methodology. So one thing I was wondering about is the choice to look not at specific rights per se, but rather at sort of groups of rights within a particular population in a particular country. So you're looking at, say, women's rights in Pakistan, or people with disabilities rights in Argentina. So not specifically looking at one right, but broadly on several rights within a context of one population. And I was wondering what that choice reflects. Is it a suggestion that human rights are more effective when we're targeting a specific population? Is it suggesting that a more holistic approach to a population than rather than a one right approach is more fitting? Is it that human rights campaigns that are not state specific but are international are at the core of the human rights enterprise rather than, again, specific rights in specific states looking at population? Then I was also wondering about that broad focus on populations and rights and what you are giving up in a process, right? When you're looking at that sort of meso level, you're missing the nuances of the specific campaigns for specific rights. You're missing the opportunity to interview the specific lawyers. You're missing the language and tone in many cases, the backlashes, public responses. And I'm wondering what you think of this trade-off and why you think giving up on that level of nuance is, paying off as an ultimate choice. Then I was also thinking about the choices of case studies, and in many ways, those are really, really challenging attempts to promote human rights. Now, of course, no attempt to promote human rights is really easy, right? I mean, that is the challenge here. But looking at women's rights in Pakistan, I mean, that's a really tough environment to put forth the issue of women's rights or reproductive rights in Ireland and so on. But then I also read what you said in page 29, acknowledging that issues of the rights of prisoners and rights of immigrants are more controversial and more difficult to pursue. And I was thinking about that additional choice that you made there, choosing case studies that are like at the, I'm not sure how to put this, so maybe like the ordinary level of difficulty that the human rights movement is facing, but not sort of like the ultimate hardest cases. Because there's a lot to be said about looking at those hard cases as your benchmark. So that was another thought. And then maybe one last point is the point in time that we're looking into this. Obviously, as you said yourself, this has to be a long-term project. But then how do you determine which case is ripe enough to provide an accurate account of the effectiveness of human rights, and which case is still, subject to backlash, and so on. So I'll stop here because, yeah, I'm getting a sense that we're really behind on time, but it was a really interesting opportunity to think about the proper methodology for this kind of task.
Thank you, Tali. This is great. I wanted to notice that. So the emphasis on the timeline and where in the timeline we are when we examine a case study brings us to the importance of the historical overview of the evolution of human rights. So we have our resident historian, Professor Andrei Mamolea, here at the Paris School of Global Studies. He's a historian of international law and politics. He specializes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His research challenges the widespread notion that the United States was the driving force behind the development of international law during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, shifting attention instead to the neglected but important role of Latin America and East Central Europe in the development of international law. He's currently working on 2 book projects that draw on extensive research in archives across Europe and the Americas. Please, Andrei, your knowledge of the critique of human rights is deep. I look forward to your historical perspective.
Thank you for the introduction, but I feel like I'm really an interloper among experts here, so I'm going to keep my remarks brief and allow as much time as possible for questions. As someone who doesn't do much research on human rights, but nonetheless teaches contemporary public international law every semester, I found the book to be a breath of fresh air. And what I found, I mean, it's going straight on the syllabus, right next to O'Connell's article on the human rights question as a sort of a response to the critiques that have been put forward. And what I really liked about it is its eclectiveness, right? When the history of human rights really began to blossom, let's say more than a decade ago, something that I was really following closely, there was sort of a push for definitiveness. This is the true definition of human rights, and a search for defining human rights and defining what were precursors and what were sort of other movements, definitiveness that I think in some cases was unhelpful, and also definitiveness in the sort of tracking when human rights really emerged, and then also sort of identifying the limits and possibilities, and in some cases identifying the irredeemable flaws of human rights according to some. But I think the best critique to this initial burst of research is that there is no one human rights movement. There's no single stream of human rights organizations. There is a variety, and to sort of encompass that variety, you need to be eclectic. You need to accept diversity and the fact that there are some movements and organizations that are more technocratic and others that are more grassroots. some that are more apolitical, and someone that embrace political mobilization, in fact, that are emerging from political mobilization, some that focus on structural change and others that ignore it, others that really are only band-aid solutions. And what I enjoyed from your book is it in taking such local approaches, it focuses on these diversity of experiences. But you can also see this in the literature review in chapter 2, which is it just does such a good job of not necessarily saying, well, I'm dispensing with all the literature. In fact, it says I'm going to incorporate some of these legitimate criticisms, and I will also acknowledge that there are social science studies that are relevant, and it does a very good job of really summarizing the developments in that area. Also looking at studies from anthropology, others from field work, which is, I think, becoming much more essential. We were acknowledging that we can't look at things very abstractly, but must instead see how diversity plays out on the ground. So I think in all those respects, the book is a welcome study. I enjoyed it immensely, and it adds the element of that is most needed, which is sort of the eclecticism. One sort of question, I think the only question that arose, it's not something that's central to the book, but something that was also in the presentation. And I was thinking that a lot of the criticisms of human rights, especially the ones that center around the displacement theory, they're not necessarily arguing that human rights is ineffective at the point of where it's not actually recruiting supporters. So you had a slide where you said, well, look, human rights is a sort of being cast as a sort of on its last legs, but yeah, we still see movements around the world employing human rights rhetoric. And I feel like much of the argument is actually human rights rhetoric is popular, is with us, but the displacement theory is precisely that it's sort of cutting off potential paths of reform. And like Ioannis sort of pushed you to address more in that direction, how do we ensure that human rights is not sort of cabined off and that it can sort of develop in more interesting ways? Because I find you're right to say, and as you say in the book, that displacement thesis has not been proven. And I do think that those who make that argument need to go through further steps. I'm seeing the same theories start to sort of make its way into my own field, the laws of war, where again, we need to be more rigorous about how we test this theory. But I wanted to just see if how do you think that the continuing sort of popularity of human rights and the mobilization for human rights can be directed in more effective ways, right? Because in tracking sort of, I know that in your study you said I'm looking at the process, not necessarily the circumstances that make it more effective in one case as opposed to another, but nonetheless, we are as lawyers, we try to be a bit prescriptive. We try to find solutions, and we never really were brought to the question: what circumstances, what circumstances, and what organizational tactics make for more effective solutions. So that is my question. But I found the book very stimulating. Chapter 2 is going on the syllabus, and I'm glad that this conversation is happening, and it's sort of becoming less abstract and more concrete with these case studies. So thank you again.
Okay, wonderful. So I would like to invite the other people in the room who, unfortunately, for technical reasons, can't be visualized on screen, to also send questions through the Q&A device. But most importantly, right now, I would like to hear back from Graínne. Please.
Great, thank you so much. You know, this is such a treat. I know we all say that, but like having people read your work and take an interest in it, talk to, reflect on it, give me your thoughts. It's so immensely helpful. I'm struck again though by the fact that I wish I could have had this, halfway through writing the book, because every time you present and get input, you think, I would rewrite it now in that way, or add that, or, you know, the blind spots and so on. So it's really immensely helpful. I suppose the only answer is to think about the next book, you know, or the next something. Just to go back to my notes, let's see, Susan. I think Susan, what you, and to some extent Ioannis said as well, is, and I appreciate that, is yes, you know, you're pushing back against some of the critiques, and that's good, but wait, the critiques are really important, salutary and central. And I completely agree with that. And maybe that doesn't come through in the book, because I feel as if the critiques are so dominant, you know, that's all that we get these days in the literature. It's sort of, Daniela will appreciate, it reminds me of, you know, EU law. We used to say, God, everyone's a Europhile, it needs critique. And now all there is critique. The system is crumbling, the EU is, you know, disintegrating, etc. And sometimes you think, whoa, hold on, you know, yes, there is all this, but let's get the whole elephant if we can. I'm not saying I've presented that, but I'm just trying to bring other things into the frame is really more what I was trying to do. Two things. One, bring something else into the frame. In other words, to say, as I think Ioannis said, yes, those parts of the system work like that. Yes, the big American NGOs deny any disempowerment or any distributive dimensions. Yes, the, you know, Geneva bureaucracy is really focused on this. Yes, the funders are hegemonic or whatever, you know, so those things are real. I didn't spend time defending the critiques because I didn't feel they needed defending. I wanted to say both they're partial, they're sometimes distorted, and there's a lot more. So that was kind of what I was doing. The other thing then is, the thing that concerns me, I suppose, and I didn't say this in the book, but it does concern me, is I do see, you know, I do see generations of students coming in, and they're all attracted. I have, you know, I'm a friend of David, so David Kennedy, I admire his work and his influence, but they're all attracted to the dystopian view, the dark side of human rights, the critique, the negative, and now with Moyne on top and Hopgood, and it's just like, I sort of worry that this movement, which needs the kind of reform that Ioannis is engaged in, which needs the kind of critical thinking, you know, to find, you know, answers to the questions Andrei was putting about what's going to work then, what are the ways we can, you know, do this better. You know, both of you, I think Susan and Ioannis said, well, you know, the critics aren't really saying, and it's true, some of them are not saying let's abandon it, but I think I tried to say in the last chapter of the book, in case any of them, which they always do, say, I'm not saying we should abandon the human rights movement, you are actually here, you know, so to kind of cite the parts where in their influential work they say we need a different movement, not the human rights movement. This is not going to happen through the human rights movement. You know, actually, you don't know that, you know, and a lot has happened through the human rights movement. And why not put energy into, and I'm thinking of the generations of students that I see coming through, I think, why not try and put your energies into setting up organizations like GLAN or Just Labs, or, you know, any of these more novel attempts to work across boundaries, to bring human rights frameworks directly into other, you know, centers of power and so on. So I suppose, you know, I don't mean the book to be a rah-rah, it's all great, everything optimistic, although I would like to inject some counterpoint to the negativity of a lot of the recent work. But I do want to point to those distortions and exaggeration, and I do want to bring in, to reframe, to bring in the potential. You know, so I guess that's you know, that's why I don't sort of spend more time on, but, you know, of course, like I agree with Susan Matua's piece is incredibly powerful, and David's, you know, what's wrong with human rights is incredibly important. You know, critique is needed, and as you say, is important in, but as long as, you know, that critique doesn't become the end point. And I think for, you know, a lot of people, I remember Mishraj, who's a very powerful writer, I can't remember where he wrote it, but wrote a review of one of Moyne's book, and he had this sort of resounding kind of call to young people to abandon the failed, human rights movement and go to radical politics. And I think radical politics without a rights framework is like, we've been there before, so there's more like it's more like a frustration at the imprecision first of the supposed alternatives, and secondly the kind of not focusing on how those critiques could be used to really create a more resilient, more effective, and more powerful human rights movement. So omissions, Susan, you're absolutely right. So I've no idea. It's a very good question. Why isn't Rajagopal there? He was at some point, and I can't remember why, So that's one of those things where I wish I'd given this presentation before the book was published. I did read his work, and his early book, I think it was from the early 2000s, on international law from below, is really interesting, and some of it touches on human rights and so on. With Catherine Sicking's norm cascade, one of the things, and this goes a little bit towards Tally's questions, I kind of deliberately, it's not easy to justify my methodology, and I'll come to that soon, but I deliberately didn't look at, the big human rights issues that had been the subject of so much earlier work: torture, disappearances, in the dictatorships and so on. I kind of wanted to look at rights that straddled this sort of socioeconomic, civil and political rights, so that's why I sort of was focusing on education, disability rights, reproductive rights, gender. I didn't make that so explicit maybe, but, that's why I think I wasn't really focusing so much then on her work on international criminal law, on, the challenging the dictatorships. I was kind of moving on to issues that were of this kind of, challenging the divide, I suppose. And also because an awful lot of that literature, the political science regression literature, the empirical big N studies, were of those kinds of civil and political rights and not of economic and social rights. Unfortunately, I'm not equipped to do that kind of methodological work, so I didn't. I'm not trying. The book isn't trying to enter the debate about do they work, don't they work. I'm assuming they do work based on the parts of the literature that looked into the conditions where domestic civil society is present and found positive correlations. I take that as a starting point, and then the book is about how, the mechanisms of how, rather than do they, don't they. So that's why I'm not equipped to do the methodological work, and I didn't really want to. I'm sufficiently convinced by the studies that show a positive correlation in these circumstances that I decided I'd take some of those circumstances where there's, either maybe not a strong democracy, but a hybrid democracy where there's active civil society and so on. But so that's why I suppose the Norm Cascade book didn't figure as large in my mind, but again, it should have and could have been there, and many others as well. I'm sure I'm going to engage in a process now for myself over the coming months of mea culpa, as I realize all the kind of work that could have better informed the book and that I haven't cited. But your other question, and what did the human rights movement really achieve in Pakistan? I like that question, and I think, I remember when I was doing the work thinking, oh my goodness, this is what kind of context in which to be a woman and to try to push the idea of gender justice. I mean, this is just the worst kind of situation. They're second, like I make that point, second from the bottom in all those global gender rankings. But, two things about that. First was then I was kind of astonished at the successes. I'm not saying the successes have transformed women's lives, but there's a framework starting to get into place. And I think one of the things I was trying to say in that chapter, and maybe I didn't do enough in drawing out, common and themes and differences between the three studies, but the timing, that you know, the gender justice movement in Pakistan, a lot of it was at this kind of more elite women's groups level, you know, the urban women, the NGOs, the kind of with the international connections and so on. But there's a growing grassroots dimension to it too these days. And I just think that, to me, one of the things I learned in writing the book was that it's really important having the social movement behind you, really important. You know, you can only achieve little victories without that. And I think that social movement is growing in Pakistan. I'm, you know, watching the Aurat marches from year to year, how they grow, how they've spread, how the rural women are coming in too. You know, I feel like saying, watch this space in a way with Pakistan. I could be wrong, because, you know, I'm fully aware, not fully aware, I'm aware to the extent that I can be through reading and talking to women in Pakistan of the enormity of the challenges there. But you know, despite that, I'm sort of impressed by the changes that have been brought about, and that they've managed to eke out, you know, through these painfully long and slow advocacy processes. So Ioannis, I've talked a bit about, so, you know, you were saying they don't really want to throw the baby out, but some of them say they do, you know, maybe they don't mean it. And I find Sam Moyne in particular flip-flops all the time. One time he's like, I'm a great supporter of human rights. And the next time he's saying, you know, this isn't where we should be putting our energies. He's a very clever, provocative writer. And as you say, he writes partly to provoke, and he does that very constructively sometimes, I think. I think it's been a great debate he's launched in many ways. But I do think those messages get out, and I just want to draw attention to them, you know, and say, okay, so a lot of people say something else. I don't know what that something else looks like, because nobody's ever depicted it. And I wonder why not draw those critical energies into the project the way you're doing and others are doing. So yeah, I you know, one of the hardest questions you're asking me about power and recognizing empowerment, disempowerment, recognizing distribution, redistribution. I'm on the fence about this one, about the extent to which it's important to say, we're going to have winners and losers, and you're going to be a loser. And part of my ambivalence about it is because I don't know that I really believe that. I know that that is how we look at it in political economy terms and so on, but, you know, there's this kind of, it's a bit bland, this T-shirt going around at the moment, you'll have seen, saying, God, I wish I could remember what it exactly is. Something like, it's not a pie, you know, recognition of my rights doesn't diminish recognition of your rights. And there's some part of me that thinks, you know, that way. Now, that's not true with resources. Resources are always distributed, although, you know, resources can be much more equitably distributed without disempowering groups. It may change the nature of the power we exercise. So I think, you know, and I don't think this is just strategic, my emphasis would be on, yes, things will change, and they'll change in uncomfortable ways, and they'll change in all kinds of ways. But I don't know that I want to go down the route of, you know, human rights is just the political fight with different language. It is a political fight, it's a politicized issue, but it has a different vision of what justice looks like, and that it's not a pie. And that thinking of it in pie terms just exacerbates conflict rather, you know. And so I think, you know, I think the ECHR case is fascinating, and all those, you know, the other ones going on at the moment around the world are terrific for what they do, like bringing environment and those very hard distributive issues together with human rights, with, you know, there's civil, political, economic, everything. It's all in there together. So I don't have answers to what would be the best strategy. I'm directing you to Cesar Rodriguez Garavito for that, you know, nor to Andrei's question the same way, what would be the best strategies? But I see that people, you know, like you and him and others are coming up with attempts to think differently about how to strategize and how to bring people on board and how to make people think differently. Because thinking differently, you know, so getting away from the pie mentality to something else can actually make a difference, making people see differently what they have to gain from a different framing and from a different way of understanding their role in some kind of inequitable situation. That's a very indirect and abstract answer, but I hope it goes some way to towards responding. So yeah, am I for more open acknowledgement of those? Well, I'm for open acknowledgement of the political dimensions, but I think I'd be trying to look for different language to express it that doesn't go, you know, in such what's the word? You know, loss benefit or zero sum kind of terms, I guess. Tali asked me all those difficult questions about methodology. Thank you for those. You know, you're absolutely right that what drove the choices, you know, are reasons that can't respond to some of your critiques, and your critiques are absolutely right. I could have done very different kinds of case studies, and if I'd focused in at a much more granular level, as you say, like right down to talk to people, to go to interview people, individuals, you know, and exactly, you know, what happened and so on. I did a little bit, I think, more of that maybe with the inclusive education study in the Argentina case, and tried to do a little bit in the case of the reproductive, the abortion rights in Ireland, but not, you know, couldn't really or didn't do anything like that for Pakistan, despite I did interview people who were involved in the struggle, but not at that level of particular individuals and their cases and what happened. I decided I would choose campaigns, because what I wanted to do in the book, and I think I've said this, but maybe it just didn't come across as explicitly as it should have, was to show how, you know, how human rights campaigns made a difference. So I picked positive cases, you know, so I'm not claiming, oh, I just looked around the world and I took 3 and guess what, they all achieved something. You know, they all did, you know, had different degrees of success, but they all had some successes. And that was why I wanted to look at them and see how did they, what was it that they did and how did this come about, or what were the strategies and what role did human rights play in these different campaigns. So they are campaigns, and, you know, I could have gone and maybe, you know, could have added a couple of extra studies, you know, that maybe were more focused on an individual case, on an individual right, and, you know, the ways in which that affected particular people, and that would have given it, you know, shone a different light. But I kind of wanted to respond to these bigger claims of human rights don't make a difference, and or you know, if they do, it's not through, you know, I wanted to show what the different dimensions of international law, domestic law, local mobilization, international fora, domestic institutions, you know, how those all played a different kind of role. So, you know, I certainly wouldn't defend the methodology as one of those, you know, I went out, I looked, and this is what I found. No, I chose them to demonstrate something. And I chose different jurisdictions and different types of rights and different continents, but I could have done a much better and more, you know, I could have gone to, like I was saying, I do regret not looking more directly at an obviously redistributive one, an economic justice campaign, and also at more repressive regimes. I looked at countries where there was a very healthy civil society. Whatever you say about Pakistan and Argentina, they have healthy civil societies, and that would be more challenging. So is there anything? So prisoners and migrants, yeah, those are the really, as you say, that would have been very interesting, because, and one of the reasons why those would be particularly difficult is that mobilization, prisoners can't mobilize, you know, so those mobilizing on their behalf are always going to be select, you know, groups, representatives, civil society, and so it's very hard also, not just because they're a particularly unpopular and despised group in many societies, but also because it's really hard to mobilize, right? It would be ex-prisoners. And the same for migrants. They're so vulnerable and so marginal often in societies that it's kind of proxy or surrogate mobilization that you're talking about. So those again would be very good hard cases to look at. I still think there is human rights mobilization on behalf of both of these groups. And I think the kinds of successes, though, that they can eke out do tend to be more, oops, out of time. Yeah, tend to be more specific and focused than the broad campaigns I'm looking at. Thank you so much to all of you. I can't believe I didn't get to Andrei, but I had all kinds of interesting thoughts that you sparked. And thank you so much to all of you for your comments. It's been really helpful. I wish I had another year to write the book.
So what I think we can do now is, because I know that we have all intense schedules, I am delighted to stay on a little bit, but I wanted to give an opportunity to people who have the next thing coming up to walk out. I just all I wanted to do. I'm very happy to stay on. I have my own question to ask. So let's see what we can do. Susan, you're going. Take care.
So just no, I just have one quick follow-up. Which is thank you for the responses to the points that we all raised. And I guess what I wanted to say about the critiques, Matua and others, is that I don't teach these critiques in order to say that is the end of the human rights project. What would I teach if I had that approach? But simply for us, the teaching is about developing a philosophy of practice in human rights that takes these critiques into account. And we have a particular philosophy in the human rights clinic that very much takes the critiques into account. We develop long-term partnerships with local organizations and follow their lead and add the value that they ask us to add to their work, and often develop a jointly agreed on strategy that addresses the key critiques. So, I mean, I've been working for decades with some of our partners. I wouldn't, based on all of the very, very legitimate criticism, I would never presume to have the hubris to go somewhere else in the world and identify what the problem is and say, okay, the international human rights system provides this mechanism and this answer. So I think the critiques have taught those of us who are practicing a great deal about developing a very nuanced philosophy of practice. So that's kind of what I wanted to put on the table.
Thank you, Susan. Graínne, I see that Andrei is with us. Feel free to tackle his comments.
I appreciate this. I also don't want to keep all of you too long. I have a class at 2, but I'm so happy to be able to continue the conversation. So the one thing I want to say was, yes, you're absolutely right, Andrei. There's a difference, and maybe it relates a little bit to Susan's question. So I completely agree with you, Susan, and I worry that maybe the book comes across as dismissive of critiques. I think the critiques are incredibly helpful, including all of those from the writers who irritate me because they're calling for the end times. You know, there's something to every critique, and something very powerful to some of them. I guess it's just that, of course, those who teach human rights and so on are not going to abandon their careers, but you know, younger people coming in to think about what they're going to do and how they can advance social justice, it depresses me to see the kind of, you know, the strength of, and I will say, one of my colleagues says, yeah, it's all the global North men who are saying it, but, you know, this argument that it's over for human rights. Find something better, find something more, you know, both exciting and has more potential, and that'll really set aside, because you know, first, I don't see what that alternative is, and secondly, I don't see a contradiction between radical political activism and a human rights framework, you know. And there was one very interesting paper someone sent me the other day. Who sent it to me? Antoine Vaucher, whose book you recently had a discussion of, and he sent me something from a young Latin American, I don't remember, was he? Yes, he was Argentinian, and he was sort of challenging the argument made not just by Moyne, but some other historians of human rights in Latin America that said, let's look around the time that they squashed sort of socialist movements and Marxist movements, you know, the human rights language swooped in, it replaced it, displaced it. And he's found these documents where he was saying, well, actually, they decided, he was showing how the Marxist activists changed their strategies and decided it was useful to embrace human rights as part of their movement. So it wasn't that they were, you know, squashed and then the neoliberals from Chicago came in with their human rights language, but rather that that was a change in strategy. So that I found that kind of interesting. But so to come back to Andrei, the displacement and end times are different, and I think that's right. So what I was saying in terms of, is it the end times of human rights? Like, is it just, you know, this is not, there's no real vitality left in this, it's this sclerotic kind of bureaucratic thing. So it's an answer to that, you know, the people on the streets and so on, that there's still a lot of vitality. It's the frame, the normative frame that animates a lot of people, and that they feel like it matters, you know, these are my rights. But you're right that it's harder to show whether or not that displaces something else. I think what I'm trying to say is, I don't think it does. I think these are perfectly, not perfectly, they're compatible, but it's true that the ways some actors have used human rights in the past has tended to be very narrow, very exclusionary of redistributive issues, or very focused on international institutions and so on. And that I guess what I'm saying, it's a bit like what Susan is saying, that, you know, that the practitioners and the teachers and so on, that the challenge is to bring the best of these critiques to animate the human rights movement, rather than, I don't know what it would be, sending people off to, I don't know what the alternative is. That's the problem. I know that it's understood as something more radical and political, but I don't see why radical political action cannot be animated by concern for human rights and work alongside or within a human rights paradigm.
Graínne, so everybody, Graínne is teaching it too. I think she needs time to to drink a glass of water in between. I am so happy that we can have this and take each other so seriously as we did today. It's actually it's wonderful. Thank you for the occasion. Thank you to the panelists for responding to my invitation. I am so pleased to have had this. I hope we can continue this. Graínne, I have a lot to ask you about the book too. I will do it when we have more time.
Over a glass of wine, Zoom, Danielle. Thank you so much to all of you. Really, I appreciate so much your interest and engagement with the book. It's great.
Take care, Graínne. Bye-bye,
all right,
everybody. Thank you. And let's stay in touch, please. Bye.
All right. Thank you. Thanks very much.